A ranger discovers a hidden cabin on the edge of a canyon. What's inside isn't a crime, but something far more disturbing, and once you understand it, there's no going back. Watch till the end, subscribe, share, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you would do in his place. The canyon always looked the same from a distance. A vast, patient wound carved into the land by water and time, indifferent to the passing of people who came and went along its rim. From above it appeared calm, almost static, but anyone who worked inside it knew better. Down among the stone walls, nothing was ever truly still. Winds shifted without warning, shadows moved like living things, and the rock itself seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting under the sun. The ranger had learned long ago not to trust the canyon's apparent silence. It was a place that waited. He had been patrolling this sector for years, long enough to stop counting them in any meaningful way. Middle-aged now, his body carried the quiet stiffness of someone who had walked too many miles on uneven ground, slept too many nights in cold cabins, and learned to measure risk without dramatics. He was not reckless, but he was no longer young enough to be careless. Every step had weight, every decision a calculation, even on days that were meant to be routine. This patrol was supposed to be exactly that, a standard check of an outer section of the park, far from visitor centers and marked trails, where the canyon narrowed and the rock walls rose steep and close. The area was technically closed to tourists, too dangerous for casual hiking, and rarely visited except by staff. His task was simple: inspect the trail edges for signs of erosion, check for illegal access, and make sure no one had wandered into a place they couldn't get out of. The morning light was sharp and clear, cutting clean lines across the stone. The sun had not yet climbed high enough to flatten the landscape, and shadows clung to the canyon walls in long, dark ribbons. To his right, the rock face pressed close, rough and pale, scarred by centuries of water and wind. To his left, the ground fell away abruptly into open space, the canyon dropping so steeply that the river below was little more than a thin, moving thread of muted green. The trail beneath his boots was narrow but familiar. He had walked this stretch dozens of times, memorizing its quirks, the places where the stone dipped or rose, where loose gravel tended to collect after a storm. He moved at a steady pace, eyes scanning ahead and to the sides, not out of fear, but habit. Experience had taught him that the canyon rarely announced its dangers. It was the stones that made him slow down. At first, the difference was subtle enough that he almost missed it. A slight change in texture underfoot, a firmness where there should have been loose grit. He paused, shifted his weight, and looked down. The stones here were set more deliberately than elsewhere, fitted together in a way that felt intentional rather than accidental. Not paved, not smooth, but arranged. Someone had taken the time to place them so that the path was more stable, less likely to crumble underfoot. That alone was unusual. Maintenance crews hadn't worked this far out in years, and if they had, there would have been records, markers, something official. He crouched slightly, running his gloved fingers over the surface. The stones were worn, their edges softened, but not by recent erosion. They looked old, shaped by many feet over a long time. He straightened and continued more slowly now. A few steps ahead, he noticed something else, the faint outline of a footprint where dust had settled between stones. It wasn't crisp enough to identify a sole pattern, but it was recent. Someone had walked here not long ago. That too was strange. There were no authorized routes beyond this point, no permits issued, no reason for anyone to be here unless they were lost, trespassing, or deliberately avoiding notice. He scanned the area, half expecting to see someone ahead, but the trail curved tightly along the rock wall, blocking his view. As he moved forward, more signs revealed themselves. Small adjustments to the path where the rock face pressed in, stones stacked to create shallow steps, edges subtly reinforced where the drop to the left grew more severe. None of it looked new, and none of it looked like the work of someone improvising in panic. This was careful, patient labor, done by someone who knew the terrain and intended the path to last. He stopped again, this time because of the markings on the wall. They were easy to overlook unless you knew to look for them. Thin, shallow lines carved into the rock at regular intervals, always at roughly the same height. Not symbols, not letters, nothing that could be read in any obvious way. They reminded him of old trailblazes, except there was no color, no modern tool marks. The lines were worn, their edges smoothed by time, as though fingers had brushed against them again and again while passing. He checked his map, unfolding it carefully in the narrow space. According to the official layout, the trail should have ended several hundred yards back, where a rockfall years ago had made further passage unsafe. Beyond that point, there was nothing marked. No path, no structure, no reason to continue. And yet here he was, standing on a trail that clearly continued. The canyon felt quieter the farther he went. Not silent, but muted, as though the usual sounds of wind and distant water had been absorbed by the stone. Even the air seemed different, heavier somehow, carrying a dry mineral scent that reminded him of places long sealed and undisturbed. He noticed the absence of birds, the lack of insects skittering across the rock. It was not dead silence, but it was restrained, held back. He told himself to turn around. Protocol would have supported that decision. Unmarked paths were hazards, and alone in a canyon like this was no place to indulge curiosity. He had done his job by identifying an anomaly. He could report it, flag the area, come back with support if necessary. Instead, he took another step forward. He justified it easily enough. The path was stable, the conditions good. If someone was using this route, it was his responsibility to find out who and why. If there was a structure ahead, it could pose a risk or represent a liability the park didn't know it had. He told himself he was being thorough, professional. The truth, he would later admit, was that something about the path felt less like a mistake and more like an invitation. The trail narrowed further, hugging the rock wall so closely that he had to turn his shoulder slightly to pass in places. His right hand brushed stone, feeling its cool roughness through the glove, while his left hovered unconsciously toward the open air, as if to balance himself against the void. The drop beside him was sheer, unforgiving, disappearing into shadow before reaching the river far below. Then the path straightened, just enough to open the view ahead. The structure did not announce itself with drama. It did not rise suddenly or dominate the landscape in any obvious way. It simply appeared, as though it had always been there, and he had finally reached the point where it could be seen. A wooden cabin stood on a narrow rocky shelf near the edge of the canyon, its silhouette dark against the pale stone behind it. It was larger than he expected, but not grand, built with plain lines and practical proportions. The wood was weathered to a muted gray-brown, blending so well with the surrounding rock that from certain angles it almost disappeared. The roof sloped gently, its surface uneven with age, and the windows were small and unadorned. What struck him most was not what he saw, but what he did not. There were no signs of collapse, no sagging beams or caved-in sections. The cabin was old, unmistakably so, but it was intact. The boards were worn but solid, the structure upright and stubborn, as if it had resisted decay through sheer persistence. There were no piles of trash, no broken furniture scattered outside, no graffiti. The ground around it was bare and clean, disturbed only by faint, orderly footprints that led to and from the door. It was not abandoned in the way abandoned places usually were. He approached slowly, each step deliberate. The path widened just slightly near the cabin, enough to allow him to stand without pressing against the wall or staring down into the canyon. From here, he could see details he had missed before. One corner of the cabin bore signs of repair, boards replaced with care and fitted to match the old ones so closely that the work was nearly invisible. The door was closed but not barricaded, its surface smooth where countless hands might have touched it over the years. He circled the structure, keeping a careful distance from the edge. There was no foundation in the conventional sense, no stilts or supports lifting it above the rock. The cabin rested directly on the stone shelf, as though it had grown there, shaped to the land rather than imposed upon it. The rock beneath it was worn smooth in places, suggesting long-term occupation, but there were no cracks, no signs that the weight had caused damage. The air around the cabin felt different, not colder or warmer, but stiller, insulated from the restless movement of the canyon. It was the kind of stillness one found in old churches or sealed rooms, a quiet that felt intentional. He stopped at the door. Up close, he could see that it was neither locked nor fully loose. It resisted slightly when he tested it, as if held in place by habit rather than hardware. The handle was smooth, polished by years of use and free of rust. Someone, at some point, had cared enough to maintain it. A familiar warning rose in his mind, the voice of training and experience reminding him that crossing certain thresholds changed things. Entering a structure like this, unrecorded and unexplained, meant responsibility. It meant paperwork, scrutiny, questions that might not have easy answers. It also meant that whatever lay inside would no longer be speculation. He took a breath, steady and controlled, and pushed the door open. The hinges made no sound. Light spilled into the interior in narrow bands, revealing a space that was spare but orderly. At first glance, it looked almost empty, the wooden floor clear, the walls bare. Then his eyes adjusted, and the pattern emerged. The bones were arranged with precision, laid out across the floor in a configuration that was immediately, unmistakably deliberate. They were clean, free of dirt or debris, placed with care rather than haste. Long bones formed lines and curves, smaller pieces filled gaps, and the overall shape was coherent in a way that defied casual explanation. He stood frozen, the weight of the sight settling over him, not as shock, but as a profound, unsettling clarity. This was not chaos. This was not the aftermath of violence or neglect. This was design. As he took a step inside, the door closing softly behind him, he sensed with sudden certainty that the trail had not simply led him here by chance. The canyon, the path, the cabin, all of it felt arranged toward this moment. And somewhere within the careful order before him, there was space left open, waiting to be understood. For a long moment he did not move, as if the simple act of shifting his weight might disturb the logic that held the room together. The air inside the cabin felt older than the wood around him, dry and close, carrying the faint mineral tang of stone and a subtler scent beneath it. Something like sun-bleached parchment, like dust that had once belonged to living things and now had been allowed to settle without interruption. Outside, the canyon still existed. The wind still passed along the cliffs. The river still cut its invisible line far below. But the cabin held those sounds at a distance, as though it had learned how to keep the world from intruding. Light entered through the small windows in narrow-angled sheets. It did not flood the interior. It selected portions of it, drawing pale geometry across the floorboards. In that restrained illumination, the arrangement became clearer, and what he had first taken as an incomprehensible pattern resolved into intent. The bones were not piled, not scattered, not abandoned. They were placed with the kind of care that came only from time and concentration. Their surfaces were clean, dulled by age and air, and yet remarkably free of dirt. No mud, no rot, no gnaw marks. Nothing that suggested animals had ever touched them, though an unprotected cabin in this canyon should have been a feast for scavengers long ago. He had seen bones before. Any ranger who spent enough years in the field eventually found them. Coyotes' work, winter's work, gravity's work. They came in disorder, as nature demanded, with teeth marks and broken ends, with weathering that spoke of seasons. These bones spoke of something else entirely. They spoke of hands. He stepped forward carefully, his boots finding the floor in the few open spaces left between the lines. The boards creaked softly under his weight, a small, ordinary sound that felt almost obscene in the presence of what lay arranged around him. He resisted the instinct to crouch immediately, to lean close, to reach out. Evidence, his training reminded him, was as much about restraint as observation. If this was a crime scene, his touch could ruin it. If it was not, his touch could still alter something he did not yet understand. He drew a slow breath and forced his mind into the language of procedure. Identify, observe, document, maintain safety. He took his phone from his pocket and raised it, but his hand hesitated. Photographing the bones felt like a violation, as if the cabin did not belong to the modern world where everything was captured and stored and reproduced. Yet the habit of accountability won. He snapped several images from the doorway, then several more from the center of the room, each taken from a slightly different angle so that the pattern could be reconstructed later. As he turned, he noticed the absence of almost everything else. There was no bed, no pile of blankets, no stack of canned food, No tools hanging from nails, no clothes draped over a chair. In a cabin this remote, someone living here would have left evidence of living. Even a careful person would leave crumbs, fibers, trash, a smell of smoke. But the space was stripped of those ordinary traces. The walls were bare except for the grain of old wood and the faint shadow lines where sunlight had fallen year after year. There were no words carved into the planks, no symbols, no prayers. If this place had been used by believers or cultists or hermits, it had been done without the usual human urge to declare meaning in marks. And still, meaning was everywhere. It was simply expressed in arrangement rather than writing. He moved closer to the nearest line of bones. A series of long, straight pieces, femurs, he thought, and perhaps tibias, had been laid end to end, their lengths aligned with the floorboards as if someone had used the cabin's architecture as a guide. Small bones filled the gaps where the ends did not meet perfectly, as though the person responsible had refused to leave any break in continuity. The line curved subtly, not because of error, but because the curve had been intended. It was too smooth to be accidental. He followed it with his eyes until it disappeared behind another configuration, a branching arrangement that reminded him vaguely of a forked trail on a map. That comparison came to him uninvited, and once it had arrived, it refused to leave. He had been staring at bones as bones, but now his mind began to see them as lines, contours, directions. He turned in place, scanning the floor as if he were standing above a landscape. The pattern was not symmetrical, and that was the first clue that it was not purely symbolic. Symmetry was what humans reach for when they wanted to impose an abstract order. Crosses, circles, perfect stars. This arrangement was irregular in a way that felt familiar. It resembled the messy, specific truth of terrain. A sharp curve here, a shallow arc there. A widening in one area as though representing a basin, a narrowing in another as though representing a ridge. His pulse slowed, not because his fear decreased, but because his mind found something to grip. It is a map, he thought. The words formed with the certainty of something recognized rather than invented. He looked to the window on the far wall, and then back to the bones. The line closest to the cabin's left side curved in a way that matched the canyon's bend as it turned northward. A cluster of smaller bones could be an outcrop, a concentration of rock. And near the center, where the light fell in a tilted rectangle, there was a space left deliberately empty. Not a gap from shifting or loss, but a clean absence, as though the maker had built the whole thing around that blank. The emptiness bothered him more than the bones themselves. The human mind could endure horror when it had an explanation. A massacre, a burial, a tragedy. These were terrible, but they fit into categories. This did not. This was not chaos. It was not violence. It was not even neglect. It was intention, and intention implied purpose. The empty space suggested that purpose was unfinished. He stepped carefully around the central absence, careful not to cross it. The floorboards there were visible, dusty but undisturbed, as if no one had placed anything there for a long time. The dust held a thin sheen, and in the light he could see that it had been smoothed in one direction, almost like a faint brush mark. He leaned closer without touching and saw that the dust was not random. It had been swept, gently, repeatedly, as if someone had wanted that space to remain clear. A cold thought slid into his mind, and his mouth went dry. Space left for what? Or for whom? He forced himself away from that and continued the inventory his training demanded. He took photographs of the entire layout, then close-ups of specific points, the junctions, the clusters, the borders around the central emptiness. He noted the cleanliness. He noted the lack of animal intrusion. He noted, too, the way the bones seemed to have been selected and arranged, as though the person who placed them understood anatomy well enough to distinguish types and sizes. He glanced toward the far corner and found, with a strange relief, that the cabin was not completely empty of living objects. Against the wall near the window sat two crude vessels, something between bowls and cups, made of fired clay, or perhaps carved from stone. They were old, their surfaces worn, and one held a residue that could have been dried plant matter. Nearby, tucked into the corner, as if it were not meant to be noticed, was a small stub of wax or tallow, blackened at one end. A candle or something like it. Not enough to prove habitation, but enough to suggest that someone had remained here long enough to need light or ritual. The vessels looked unused recently, their interiors dusty. Yet they were placed with a kind of careful austerity, as if they belonged to a discipline that rejected comfort. He imagined a person sitting in this room for hours, days, weeks, watching the light shift across bones, feeding the central absence with attention. The image was unsettling not because it was violent, but because it was devout. He backed toward the door and looked out. Outside, the sunlight was harsh and bright, the canyon walls blinding in places. The narrow trail lay exactly as he had walked it, a thin line pressed against rock, the void to the left yawning open. The cabin, from this angle, looked almost ordinary, a remote shelter built by someone stubborn and skilled. It was only inside that its true strangeness revealed itself, as though the cabin had been designed to appear harmless until one crossed its threshold. He stepped out and turned to face the canyon, drawing in air that felt suddenly young and sharp. The sensation of stepping into open light was like surfacing from deep water. He took out his radio, but the canyon often swallowed signals, and he knew he might have to climb to a better point. Still, he tried. The first attempt crackled uselessly, a thin thread of static and nothing more. He tried again, changing his stance, raising the radio higher, turning slightly. On the third try, the signal caught, faint but present. He identified himself, gave his sector, and spoke in the concise, controlled language required for emergencies. He reported an unregistered structure, probable human remains, and requested law enforcement and a medical examiner. He avoided interpretation. He did not mention the map. He did not mention the empty space. Those were details for later, when he could explain them without sounding insane. When he finished, the only sound was the wind. He waited in a patch of shade near the cabin wall, keeping his eyes on the trail behind him and on the narrow ledge that extended beyond the cabin's far side. The canyon seemed to hold its breath. Minutes passed, then more. The sun climbed higher, and the light shifted slowly, making the cabin's weathered boards glow warmer. He could not stay still. After a while, he returned to the doorway and looked in again, more cautiously this time, as if expecting the bones to have rearranged themselves in his absence. They had not. The pattern remained as he had left it, quiet and precise. Yet the light had changed. The beam from the far window now reached deeper into the room, angling toward the central emptiness. The dust there shimmered faintly, and the empty space took on a strange prominence, like the center of a stage. He felt the urge to step into that space, to stand where the absence was, to see what the map would look like with him inside it. The thought came with such sudden clarity that it startled him. He recognized it as something foreign, not his own impulse. His whole career had been built on avoiding unnecessary risk, on not stepping into unknown spaces without reason. And yet here, in this cabin, his mind offered the image as if it were the next logical step. He retreated, closing the door halfway without meaning to. The movement was instinctive, as though he wanted to put a barrier between himself and the invitation he had just felt. He returned to the shade outside and forced himself to focus on the practical. Help was coming. It might take time, given the location, but they would come. In the meantime, he would preserve the scene as best he could. He walked the perimeter again, keeping his steps careful. He looked for tracks near the door and found what he had suspected earlier. Faint impressions, not fresh enough to be wet, but definite enough to show a pattern. The marks were too indistinct to identify a specific boot brand. They looked like soft soles, perhaps wrapped feet, leaving pressure but not sharp tread. The tracks went both ways along the trail, toward the canyon and away from it, suggesting repeated passage rather than a single visit. He crouched near the edge of the ledge and studied the rock where the cabin met stone. There were scratches there, thin and regular, like the remnants of something dragged repeatedly. A heavy object moved in and out? A door? A crate? He followed the scratches with his eyes and saw they ended near the cabin's side wall, where the boards were slightly newer. The repair he had noticed. It looked almost invisible in the broad light, but up close it revealed itself in the subtle difference of grain. Someone had tended this place, not long ago. The realization tightened his chest, If someone was still using the cabin, then he was not simply guarding a relic. He was intruding into a living system, one that functioned without official permission and without the usual human messiness. It was as though the people who came here had trained themselves to leave no trace except the trace that mattered. He checked his phone. No service. He listened again to the wind. It carried nothing but itself. Hours later, he heard the first distant sound of movement along the cliff, a scrape of rock, a clink of gear, voices muffled by distance. Relief came in a brief rush, followed immediately by a new tension. Now he would have to explain. Now the cabin would become part of a larger machinery. Reports, investigations, bureaucratic language that tried to flatten everything into categories. He met the first officers where the trail widened slightly, guiding them with the calm authority of someone who had navigated far worse terrain. They moved cautiously, harnesses and ropes in place, their faces tight with the concentration required for the narrow path. Behind them came two more figures, one carrying a case marked for forensic work, another with the posture and expression of someone used to looking at death without flinching. He led them to the cabin and watched their reactions as they entered. There was surprise as he had expected, but not the kind born of gore. It was the surprise of encountering intention where one expected randomness. The forensic specialist paused at the threshold, eyes scanning the floor. The medical examiner's expression changed in a way the ranger had seen before, not from horror but from the cold sharpening of professional curiosity. They began their work with slow, methodical movements. Photographs, measurements, careful notes. They did not step into the central emptiness, perhaps because they sensed, as he had, that it was not simply a gap. The examiner crouched and studied a bone without touching it, then another. He murmured to the officer beside him, and the officer nodded, scribbling. The ranger kept himself close but not intrusive. He watched their hands, their eyes, the way their attention moved across the pattern. He tried to read their thoughts through their posture, the small adjustments they made as they attempted to categorize what they saw. The medical examiner eventually spoke to the lead officer, who stepped outside with him to avoid contaminating the room with unnecessary movement. The ranger followed to the doorway and listened, not as an eavesdropper, but as the one who had found the place and therefore carried responsibility for it. The conclusion, when it came, was not what he had feared. There were no obvious signs of violence, no fractures consistent with assault, no marks of cutting or gunshot. The bones were weathered differently, suggesting they did not all belong to one individual. The examiner's rough estimate placed some remains as decades old, some older. This was not a fresh crime scene. If anything criminal had happened, it had happened long ago, or not at all. They spoke of natural death in cautious terms: starvation, exposure, illness, time. The words sounded strange in the bright canyon light, as though death here had been something quiet and patient rather than sudden. The officers' reactions shifted accordingly. Their initial urgency softened. Without blood, without clear evidence of murder, the place became less a crisis and more a complication. It was remote, difficult to access, and clearly tied to something long-term. The lead officer asked the ranger how long the cabin had been here, and the ranger answered honestly. He did not know. It wasn't on maps. It wasn't in records. He had never seen it before today. That admission, he sensed, created an immediate problem. If the park had an unregistered structure containing human remains, it meant liability, public scrutiny, questions that would reach above all of them. The officers did not say this out loud, but the change in their demeanor was unmistakable. They began to talk about sealing the area, about notifying higher authorities, about taking samples and leaving the rest for later. The ranger felt a flicker of frustration. Later, in bureaucratic language, often meant never. He offered what he had noticed. The trail looked maintained. The cabin showed signs of repair. There were tracks. The bones were arranged deliberately, as if by ritual. That last word, ritual, landed in the space between them like a stone dropped into water. The officers exchanged a glance, and the lead officer's mouth tightened. He asked what kind of ritual, and the ranger said he could not say, only that it was too organized to be random. They returned to the cabin to continue documentation. The forensic specialist took more photographs. then began measuring distances between bones, mapping the map. The ranger watched the process and realized that even with their equipment and training, they were struggling with the same thing he had struggled with. Not the sight of bones, but the meaning of their order. At one point, the examiner stood near the doorway and glanced toward the central emptiness. His gaze lingered there, and his expression hardened briefly, as though he recognized something he did not want to name. The ranger's skin prickled. He stepped closer to see what the examiner had seen, but nothing had changed. The light, however, had shifted again. The sun was higher now, and the beam that entered through the far window struck the floor in a way that illuminated the edges of the empty space with almost unnatural clarity. Dust glowed there. The emptiness appeared framed. It looked for a moment like a place prepared. The officers decided eventually to withdraw. They could not remove the remains safely today. The trail was too narrow, the canyon too unforgiving. They would return with a larger team, perhaps with aerial support. In the meantime, they would secure the site as best they could. A temporary marker would be placed at a safe distance. The ranger would file an incident report and coordinate with park management. The ranger nodded, agreeing outwardly to everything, but inwardly he felt the pressure of something closing. Once paperwork began, once the cabin became a file and a case number, the simple purity of the mystery would be flattened. The map would become arrangement of remains. The empty space would become unoccupied center, and whatever this place truly was would be buried under language. When the group began their careful retreat along the narrow trail, the ranger remained behind for a final check. He watched their figures move away, one by one. Pressed against the rock wall, their ropes taut, their footsteps measured. The canyon swallowed their voices quickly. In a matter of minutes, he was alone again with the cabin. He turned back to it. The door stood ajar, as the forensic specialist had left it. The interior was dimmer now, the beam of light thinner as the sun's angle changed. He stepped close enough to see inside without entering. The bones lay exactly as before. The map remained intact. The emptiness remained empty. Yet he could not shake the sense that something had shifted, not in the physical arrangement, but in the relationship between himself and the place. He had brought outsiders here. He had acknowledged the cabin to the machinery of the world, and still, the cabin remained what it had always been, as though indifferent to officials and reports. He reached for the door and pushed it more firmly closed, not locking it, because there was no lock, but setting it into the position it seemed to prefer. The movement was quiet, almost reverent, and he realized with a sudden unease that he was treating the cabin less like a crime scene and more like a sanctuary. He stepped back into the sunlight and looked out over the canyon. The river below glinted faintly. The air was warm, the wind steady. The world did not change because he had found bones arranged as a map. The canyon did not react. The sky remained a wide, indifferent blue. And yet the emptiness inside the cabin sat in his mind like a question that had teeth. He began the careful walk back along the trail, following the officer's path, but his eyes kept returning to the thin markings on the rock wall. The shallow lines, worn smooth, seemed suddenly more significant. Not random scratches, not accident, but guidance. Quiet instructions for those who knew how to read them. He realized as he moved that he had done what any responsible person would do. He had called the police. He had preserved the scene. He had initiated procedure. And still, none of that had answered the only question that mattered. Who had made the map? And why had they left a place in the center of it unfilled, as though waiting for the final piece to arrive? The canyon did not keep secrets well once people began to move through it in numbers. The careful quiet that had wrapped itself around the cabin the day before dissolved under the weight of ropes, harnesses, metal clips striking stone, and voices forced into low tones by height and caution. By the time the ranger returned with the expanded team, the place already felt altered, not physically, but socially, as if the land itself were aware that it had been noticed. They came prepared this time. More officers, more equipment, cases marked with official seals, devices meant to measure, catalog, and translate the unknown into data. Getting them there was slow and difficult. Only a few could move along the narrow trail at once, and each had to be clipped in, guided, warned where to place a foot and where not to linger. The ranger found himself acting as both guide and gatekeeper. directing traffic with the quiet authority of someone who understood that one mistake here would not allow for correction. From the beginning, there was tension, not the open kind that came with fear or confrontation, but the restrained tension of professionals who sensed they were dealing with something that refused to fit into their frameworks. The canyon amplified this unease. It gave no margin for casual movement, no wide ground where people could gather and talk comfortably. Every conversation happened close to the rock, voices subdued, eyes always flicking toward the drop at the edge of vision. Inside the cabin, the work resumed. Photographs were taken again, from higher resolution cameras this time, with reference markers placed carefully at measured distances. The forensic specialists moved with deliberate slowness, stepping only where the ranger indicated open floor remained. Laser measures traced distances between bones, angles between lines, the dimensions of the empty center. Everything was recorded, mapped, logged. Yet the longer they worked, the more obvious it became that they were struggling not with the task itself, but with the absence of a narrative. There was no clear sequence of events to reconstruct, no obvious cause and effect chain. The bones did not tell a story of violence, nor of panic, nor of concealment. They told a story of patience. The medical examiner confirmed what had already been suspected. The remains belonged to multiple individuals. Age at death varied widely. Some bones were significantly older than others, their surfaces more worn, their color dulled almost to gray. Others were lighter, less weathered, though still far from recent. None showed trauma consistent with assault. No cut marks, no bullet fractures, no signs of hurried dismemberment. Whatever had happened here had unfolded slowly, over decades. The cause of death, as much as it could be inferred, pointed toward natural processes. Starvation, perhaps, or prolonged illness, exposure, age. The examiner was careful with language, qualifying every statement, but the implication was unmistakable. These people had not been killed. They had stayed. That distinction should have simplified matters. Instead, it made everything more difficult. Without a crime, there was no clear jurisdictional urgency. Without violence, there was no obvious suspect. Without recent death, there was no immediate threat to public safety. The officers began to shift subtly, their posture loosening just enough to suggest that the situation was being mentally downgraded from crisis to inconvenience. The ranger noticed it and felt a quiet resistance rise in him. He had seen this before, in cases where complexity outpaced clarity. When an incident could not be easily explained, it became easier to minimize it, to label it something old, something closed, something best left to archives rather than action. Conversations began to happen away from the cabin, on the slightly wider stretch of trail where people could stand without clinging to the rock. The ranger caught fragments of them as he passed. Words like historical, religious, isolated, phrases like no immediate danger and limited resources. Someone suggested that the cabin might have been an informal hermitage, used by fringe believers long ago. Someone else pointed out that pursuing that angle would require cooperation from religious organizations, many of which would deny any connection. The lead officer listened, nodding, his expression neutral. He was experienced enough to know when a case was drifting toward administrative paralysis. When he finally spoke, it was with the careful tone of someone trying to draw boundaries before things became complicated. They would document what they could today. They would take samples where appropriate. The remains themselves would not be removed yet. Transporting them safely from such a location would require additional planning and approval. In the meantime, the site would be marked as restricted. The ranger would coordinate with park management to ensure the area remained closed. The ranger asked about follow-up, about tracing identities, about missing persons reports. The officer acknowledged the questions, but his answers were vague. It would depend on what higher authorities decided. It would depend on whether there was reason to believe a crime had occurred. It would depend. Dependence was the language of delay. He watched as paperwork began to take precedence over observation. Forms were filled, signatures exchanged, photographs cataloged into folders that would soon be uploaded and abstracted. The map of bones, so immediate and unsettling in person, began to dissolve into labels and measurements. The empty center was described as an unoccupied area. The arrangement became an intentional placement of remains of unknown, cultural significance. The ranger felt an unexpected surge of irritation. Not because the officers were careless, they were not, but because the process itself seemed incapable of holding what the place actually was. It reduced everything to categories that felt inadequate. As the day wore on, another subtle change occurred. He noticed it first in the officers' demeanor. They grew quieter, less inclined to speculate aloud. When they did speak, it was with a faint edge of discomfort. The silence inside the cabin seemed to press outward, influencing them despite themselves. At one point, the forensic specialist paused near the center of the room, her gaze fixed on the empty space. She said nothing, but the ranger saw her swallow, her hand tightening briefly around her measuring device. She stepped back and resumed her work without explanation. Later, while reviewing photographs on a tablet, the lead officer frowned. The ranger asked what was wrong, and the officer hesitated before answering. He said the images made less sense than the room itself. The pattern looked distorted when flattened, harder to read, as if the meaning of the arrangement depended on standing within it, on being physically present. That observation unsettled the ranger more than he expected. He had felt it too, that the cabin resisted translation, that it demanded presence. By mid-afternoon, the decision was made to wrap up for the day. The team could not stay longer without risking fatigue on the narrow trail. Equipment was packed, samples secured, markers placed discreetly at a distance from the cabin. The ranger was instructed to file a comprehensive report and to refrain from discussing the site outside official channels. As the officers prepared to leave, one of them asked casually whether the ranger had ever seen anything like this before. The ranger shook his head. The officer nodded as if confirming something to himself and said nothing more. They moved out carefully, one by one, disappearing along the trail. The canyon swallowed them quickly as it had before, restoring its quiet with unsettling speed. The ranger remained behind again, standing at the edge of the wider section of path, watching until the last figure vanished from sight. When he turned back toward the cabin, he felt the familiar pull, the sense that he was returning to something that had already claimed him in some subtle way. He did not go inside this time. Instead, he circled the structure slowly, examining details that had seemed insignificant before. The repaired boards along the side wall drew his attention again. In daylight, their craftsmanship became more obvious. The repair was recent, perhaps within the last year or two, but it matched the old wood so precisely that only someone with patience and skill could have done it. This was not the work of vandals or squatters. Near the base of the wall, he found faint scuff marks on the stone, as though something had been dragged repeatedly along the same path. The marks were shallow, smoothed by time and weather, but still visible if one looked closely. They led from the cabin's side toward a spot near the edge of the ledge, then stopped abruptly. He crouched there, careful not to get too close to the drop, and studied the rock. There were no hooks, no anchors, no evidence of ropes. Whatever had been moved here had not been lowered or lifted mechanically. It had been handled simply, deliberately. He stood and looked back at the cabin. The door was closed now as the officers had left it. The windows reflected the canyon walls, making the interior impossible to see from outside. From this angle, the structure looked inert, almost ordinary again, and yet he could not shake the sense that it was aware of his attention. He made his way back along the trail as evening approached. The light softened, shadows lengthened, and the canyon regained some of its earlier depth. When he reached a point where the trail widened enough for him to stop safely, he looked back one last time. The cabin was already blending into the rock, its outline fading as the angle changed. Back at the ranger station, the contrast was jarring. Fluorescent lights, flat surfaces, the low hum of electronics. He filed his report carefully, choosing his words with precision. He described the structure, the remains, the lack of violence. He avoided interpretation. He did not mention how the arrangement resembled a map, nor how the empty space felt intentional. Those observations, he sensed, would not survive the administrative process intact. When he finished, he sat back and stared at the screen. The report looked clean, professional, complete, and yet it felt false, not because it contained lies, but because it omitted something essential. Over the next days, the response from higher authorities arrived with disheartening predictability. The case was categorized as a historical site of uncertain origin. Further investigation was deemed low priority. The remains would eventually be removed for analysis, but there was no urgency. The area would remain closed to the public indefinitely. Indefinitely was another word for forgotten. The ranger read the emails twice, then a third time. There was no overt dismissal of his concerns, no reprimand. There was simply a gentle but firm redirection. Focus on your assigned duties. Let the appropriate departments handle the rest. He complied outwardly. He returned to his routine patrols, his daily reports. He did his job. But the canyon had changed for him. Every time he walked its paths, he saw potential deviations, faint markings, places where the land seemed to invite movement beyond the official lines. At night, he found himself thinking about the bones, about the order, about the silence inside the cabin. He thought about the people who had come there, whoever they were, and about the patience required to arrange such a map. Not in a single act, but over time. One evening, he sat with old park records spread across his desk, more out of restlessness than intention. He began leafing through them, not searching for the cabin explicitly, but for anomalies. Notes about unofficial trails, mentions of hermits or recluses, reports of people seen and then never seen again. The entries were sparse, easy to overlook. A ranger decades ago had mentioned encountering a man living off-grid near the canyon who declined assistance and vanished a year later. Another report spoke of a group of religious wanderers passing through, leaving no trace but rumors. None of them referenced a cabin. None of them were followed up. He realized then that the police were not wrong in one sense. There was no crime here that fit their mandate. What unsettled him was not what had happened, but what had been allowed to happen repeatedly, quietly, without interference. The silence surrounding the cabin was not accidental. It was the product of institutional fatigue, of systems designed to respond to violence, but not to voluntary disappearance. The police did not like silence because silence could not be interrogated. Late one night, long after he should have gone home, he pulled out a detailed topographical map of the canyon and spread it across his desk. He marked the location of the cabin as precisely as he could. Then, almost without thinking, he began tracing the lines of the terrain, the curves of the river, the ridges and drops. His hand paused. The shapes he was drawing felt familiar. He leaned back, heart beating a little faster now, and stared at the map. The realization came slowly, reluctantly. The pattern in the cabin was not symbolic. It was accurate, too accurate to be coincidence. Whoever had made the map of bones had known the canyon intimately. They had known it not as a place to pass through, but as a place to remain within. And somewhere woven into that knowledge was a reason the authorities preferred not to look too closely. The more the official investigation receded into paperwork and polite indifference, the more the ranger felt the pull to understand what had been quietly set aside. It was not defiance that drove him, nor a sense of heroism. It was something closer to professional integrity mixed with a deeper unease. The kind that refused to fade simply because a superior had decided the matter was inconvenient. The canyon had not let go of him, and the cabin had not loosened its grip on his thoughts. Silence, he was beginning to understand, was not the absence of information. It was a condition that had been cultivated. He began where all unresolved stories eventually lead: the archives. The ranger station maintained records that stretched back decades, some digitized, many still bound in aging folders that smelled faintly of dust and ink. Patrol logs, incident reports, handwritten notes from men and women who had walked these lands long before him. Most of it was mundane, a record of erosion checks, weather anomalies, injured hikers, and lost livestock. But buried among the routine were small irregularities, notes that did not quite belong. He found the first one late one evening, flipping pages without any particular expectation. A patrol entry from nearly 40 years earlier mentioned a narrow, unofficial trail discovered along the canyon wall. The ranger who wrote it noted that the trail appeared maintained without authorization and led to an area that was not marked on any current map. There was no follow-up, no closure. The next entry, weeks later, made no reference to it at all. He marked the page and kept going. Another record, older still, referenced a lone individual encountered near the canyon edge. The man had refused assistance, spoken calmly, and claimed to be on a personal retreat. The ranger at the time had noted that the man carried no visible supplies beyond a small pack and declined to say where he was staying. The entry ended with a recommendation to monitor the area. No later record indicated that anyone had done so. As the ranger continued his search, a pattern began to emerge. Mentions of people who passed through the area briefly, then disappeared from the records. Individuals described as religious wanderers, ascetics, seekers. None were reported missing in a conventional sense. Their absence did not trigger alarms because their departure had been framed as voluntary. They had not fled danger. They had not vanished unexpectedly. They had left in a way that required no response. That detail unsettled him more than any talk of cults or crimes. Voluntary disappearance existed in a gray zone, one that institutions were poorly equipped to handle. There was no victim to rescue, no perpetrator to pursue, only a choice that fell outside the boundaries of concern. He expanded his search beyond the park's records. Through professional channels and quiet inquiries, he accessed municipal archives, old census data, church registries. The work was slow and often frustrating. Names changed. Records ended abruptly. Some individuals seemed to simply evaporate from documentation, their last appearance marked by a note indicating withdrawal from public life. It was in church archives that the picture sharpened. Several names appeared in connection with small, insular religious communities that had existed on the fringes of society. Some were former monks, others lay members who had taken vows later in life. These were not mainstream institutions. They were loosely organized, often transient, emphasizing personal withdrawal from the world rather than communal worship. Many of them dissolved quietly over time, leaving little trace beyond scattered notes and abandoned properties. In multiple cases, the ranger found references to a concept described in different language, but with strikingly similar meaning. A final threshold, a place of departure. Not death as an act of despair, but disappearance as an offering. The idea was not widespread, but it recurred often enough to suggest that it had traveled, passed from one individual to another, like a whispered instruction. None of the texts named a location outright. There were no coordinates, no maps. Instead, there were descriptions that could only make sense to someone already familiar with the land, a path that narrows until there is no room for doubt, a shelter that does not announce itself, a place where the world's demands finally fall silent. The ranger closed one such document and sat back, rubbing his eyes. He was not reading superstition or madness. The tone of these writings was calm, disciplined, almost administrative. These were people who believed deeply in order, in responsibility, in leaving no burden behind. They did not speak of escape. They spoke of completion. The realization settled heavily in his chest. The people whose bones lay arranged in the cabin had not come there accidentally, nor under coercion. They had come with intention, guided by a shared understanding that had persisted quietly across generations. He returned to the canyon alone a week later, ostensibly to check on trail conditions after a minor weather event. The official restriction was still in place, but enforcement was minimal. No one else wanted to go there. He took the same narrow path, his movements careful but familiar now. The markings on the rock wall no longer felt mysterious. They felt functional, like the last remnants of a language designed to be overlooked by those who did not need it. At the cabin, he paused before entering. He noticed something immediately that had not been there before, or perhaps he had not been ready to see it. The area around the structure was too clean, not just orderly, but recently tended. Small stones had been moved aside. The edge of the path near the door had been reinforced again, subtly with pieces that matched the surrounding rock. Someone had been here since the police left. Inside, the arrangement of bones was unchanged. The map remained intact, the lines precise, the empty center untouched. But the air felt different, not warmer or colder, but occupied. As if the space remembered recent presence, he moved slowly around the perimeter, noting the minimal living objects again, the clay vessels, the remnants of plant matter. He recognized some of the dried leaves now from his archival research. Plants associated with fasting rituals, used to dull hunger or extend endurance. This was not a place of sudden death. It was a place designed for staying. As he stood there, the idea that had been forming in his mind finally crystallized. These people had not come here to die. They had come here to leave, to step out of the world in a way that did not implicate anyone else. No dramatic gestures, no cries for attention, just a gradual surrender of presence. The bones were not evidence of tragedy. They were records. Each individual who completed the process added themselves to the map, not as a name or a story, but as a shape, a contribution to a larger understanding of the land. The canyon was not just the setting, it was the framework. Their final act was to align themselves with it, to become part of its form. The ranger felt a tightening in his throat. He thought of his own life, of the years spent in service, in adherence to rules and boundaries. He had not sought disappearance, but he had lived close to it, skirting the edges of personal absence through routine and restraint. The idea that someone might choose to leave without causing harm struck him as both terrifying and profoundly disciplined. He returned to the station with more questions than answers. Days passed. Emails went unanswered. Requests for additional access to records were delayed or quietly denied. It became clear that his superiors preferred the matter to fade. The cabin was not to become a story. It was to remain an anomaly, an unresolved footnote. He did not argue. Instead, he copied what he could. Notes, dates, fragments of writing. He began to build his own record, one that did not rely on official approval. The more he gathered, the clearer the pattern became. The disappearances came in waves, separated by long periods of inactivity. Each wave coincided with moments of broader social disruption, economic collapse, war, cultural upheaval. Times when individuals might feel the pull to withdraw completely. One name appeared repeatedly in his research, always indirectly. A ranger who had worked this sector decades earlier. His reports hinted at unusual paths, at solitary figures encountered and then never seen again. Then abruptly, his name vanished from the records. No retirement notice, no transfer. He simply stopped appearing. The ranger felt a chill as he realized the implication. He was not the first to notice the cabin. He was simply the latest. That night, he stood outside his own home longer than usual before going in, listening to the ordinary sounds of a settled life. A neighbor's television, a dog barking in the distance. He imagined what it would mean to step away from all of it, not in anger or despair, but with calm deliberation. The thought frightened him. It also, to his surprise, made a terrible kind of sense. As he lay awake later, the image of the map returned to him. The bones, the lines, the curves that mirrored the canyon's shape, and always at the center, the empty space. He understood now that it was not an oversight. It was not a missing piece. It was an invitation. The people who had come before had chosen to fill their place. The question that remained, the one the authorities had no interest in asking, was why the place still waited. The decision to return was not made all at once. It emerged gradually, the way erosion reshapes stone, imperceptible in the moment, but undeniable when viewed over time. The ranger did not wake up one morning, resolved to go back to the cabin. Instead, the thought began to insert itself into the quiet spaces of his days. Between routine patrols, between reports filed and emails unanswered, between the steady repetition of duties that now felt oddly distant from their original purpose. He prepared carefully, telling himself it was for professional reasons. If someone was still accessing the site, that alone justified further inspection. If the trail was being maintained without authorization, that was a safety issue. If the cabin continued to function as a destination, then ignoring it was no longer neutral. Preparation gave his return the appearance of necessity rather than desire, and he clung to that distinction. He went alone. The morning he chose was clear and bright, the kind of day when the canyon revealed every edge and depth without ambiguity. He packed light, deliberately so. No excess food, no unnecessary equipment. He brought only what he would need to move safely and to observe. As he stepped onto the narrow trail once more, he felt the subtle shift he had come to recognize. The sense that the land was no longer merely a setting, but an active participant. The path felt different beneath his boots. Not altered in any dramatic way, but more precise, as though someone had taken the time to refine it since his last visit. Loose stones had been moved aside. The most precarious edge had been reinforced with fragments that blended seamlessly into the surrounding rock. It was work done patiently, invisibly, by someone who understood that the best maintenance was the kind no one noticed. As he moved along the rock wall, he became aware of how quiet his own thoughts had grown. The usual mental noise, the cataloging of risks and procedures, faded into the background. His focus narrowed to the placement of his feet, the texture of stone beneath his hand, the rhythm of his breathing. It was not fear that sharpened him, but a strange clarity, as though the path itself demanded a certain attentiveness. The cabin appeared as it had before, emerging from the bend in the trail without announcement. In the bright light, it looked almost welcoming, its weathered boards warmed by the sun, its outlines steady against the vastness of the canyon. The sense of intrusion he had felt on his first visit was gone. In its place was something more unsettling, a feeling of recognition. He paused outside, taking in details with a care that bordered on reverence. The repairs along the sidewall were even more evident now, though still subtle. A single board near the base had been replaced recently enough that its grain had not yet fully dulled, though it had been treated to blend with the others. The door, closed but unlatched, bore fresh traces of handling, faint smudges where fingers had rested. Inside, the air was cool and still. The familiar scent greeted him, dry and mineral, layered with something faintly herbal. The bones lay as they always had, their arrangement unchanged, their lines unwavering. The map remained intact, a silent record of those who had come and stayed. He did not approach the center at first. Instead, he walked the perimeter, observing details he had overlooked before. Near one wall, he noticed a shallow depression in the floorboards, worn smooth by repeated pressure. A place where someone had knelt, perhaps, or sat for long periods. The wear was too localized to be accidental. He found additional vessels tucked into a corner he had not examined closely before. They were simple, utilitarian, and carefully cleaned. One contained residue he now recognized as the remnants of a bitter infusion, a plant known to suppress appetite and dull physical sensation. Another held nothing but dust, its interior scraped smooth as if it had once held something more substantial. These were not the tools of survival. They were the tools of discipline. As he stood there, pieces of the pattern he had uncovered through his research began to align. The cabin was not a refuge for the desperate. It was not a place of sudden decision. It was designed for duration, for weeks, perhaps months of gradual withdrawal. The people who came here did not come to end their lives abruptly. They came to unthread themselves from it. He imagined the process now with disturbing clarity. The arrival, cautious and deliberate. The settling in, the reduction of needs. Fewer meals, shorter movements, less speech, perhaps none at all. A slow relinquishing of the body's demands, guided not by despair, but by intention. When death came, it would not have been violent or dramatic. It would have arrived quietly, as the final step in a sequence already accepted. The arrangement of bones, then, was not an afterthought. It was the culmination. Each person who completed the process had taken responsibility for those who came before, organizing the remains with care, integrating themselves into the map. In doing so, they acknowledged their place within the larger order of the land. Their final labor was not for themselves alone, but for the continuity of the place. The ranger felt a tightening behind his eyes, not grief exactly, but something close to awe. He had spent his career protecting landscapes from damage, from exploitation, from human carelessness. Here was a place shaped by humans who had chosen to minimize their impact to the point of erasure. He turned his attention to the central emptiness at last. The space remained untouched, its boundaries defined not by physical barriers, but by absence. The dust there was smooth, swept again since his last visit. Someone had been careful to preserve it. He knelt at the edge without crossing into it and studied the surrounding lines. From this angle, the alignment was unmistakable. The emptiness corresponded precisely to the cabin's location within the broader canyon map, a focal point around which everything else oriented itself. It was not a placeholder for death. It was a marker for presence. A realization settled over him with quiet force. The cabin did not exist merely as a destination. It functioned as a mechanism, a filter. Not everyone who found it stayed. Not everyone who walked the trail was accepted. Those who reached this point and chose to leave their mark had done so because they were already prepared to relinquish everything else. The cabin did not take people. It selected for readiness. A sound outside drew his attention. He rose and moved to the doorway, peering out onto the narrow ledge. There were no voices, no footsteps approaching along the trail. Instead, he noticed subtle changes in the environment. A small stack of stones near the path's edge that had not been there before, arranged to reinforce a weak point. A faint imprint in the dust near the door, fresher than the others, the mark of a soft soul. Someone was tending the place. The idea that there might be a living caretaker, or caretakers, had hovered at the edges of his thoughts before. Now it felt unavoidable. The maintenance was too consistent, too skilled, to be accidental. Whoever did this understood the cabin's purpose and respected it enough to remain invisible. The ranger felt the strange sensation of being observed without seeing an observer. It was not threatening. It was evaluative. He stepped back inside and closed the door partway, not to shut the world out, but to quiet his own thoughts. The cabin seemed to respond to stillness. The longer he remained without moving, the more the space felt settled, as though it rewarded restraint. He sat on the worn spot near the wall and let time pass. Minutes stretched, then more. He became acutely aware of his own body, of hunger just beginning to stir, of the slight ache in his legs from the narrow trail. The cabin did nothing to alleviate these sensations. It simply made them impossible to ignore. He understood then that staying here would require a confrontation with the self that no amount of belief could bypass. He did not stay long enough to test that boundary. When he finally rose and stepped back into the sunlight, he carried with him a clarity that unsettled him more than any fear. The rules of the cabin were not written. They were embodied. Come only if you are willing to leave. Stay only if you are prepared to disappear without complaint. Take responsibility for those who came before. Leave nothing behind but order. As he made his way back along the trail, he noticed again the careful reinforcement of the path, the subtle guidance of the markings. They were not there to lure the lost. They were there to support the committed. By the time he reached the wider section of the trail, he knew something had changed. The cabin was no longer an object of investigation alone. It had become a measure, one against which he could not help but compare his own life. He returned to the station with the weight of that comparison heavy on him. The routines resumed, the reports, the patrols, the polite distance maintained by superiors who did not want to know more. But beneath it all, the image of the empty center persisted, no longer as a mystery, but as a question aimed directly at him. The rules of the cabin were clear now. What remained unclear was whether he could live with the knowledge of them without eventually answering in kind. After his return from the cabin, the ranger tried, with deliberate effort, to reassert the structure of his ordinary life. He followed his schedules precisely, completed reports on time, and avoided the canyon sector whenever his assignments allowed it. Outwardly, nothing in his conduct suggested distraction or obsession. Inwardly, however, the empty place followed him with an insistence that no amount of routine could dissolve. It was not an image that replayed itself dramatically, nor a voice that whispered temptation. It was a fixed point, a quiet absence around which his thoughts began to arrange themselves without his consent. He attempted to reframe the cabin as an anomaly, a historical curiosity that had been uncovered and properly reported. He reminded himself that institutions existed to absorb such discoveries, to render them harmless through process. And yet each time he reviewed the official correspondence, the same evasion stood out. Requests for expanded access to records were declined or delayed. His suggestion to conduct a controlled interdisciplinary study of the site was acknowledged politely and then ignored. The tone was never hostile. It was worse than that. It was gently dismissive, as if the subject itself were an inconvenience that might evaporate if left unattended. The ranger began to sense that the resistance was not purely bureaucratic. It was as though those above him understood, instinctively if not consciously, that the cabin represented a kind of problem their systems were not designed to solve. Crimes could be investigated, Hazards could be mitigated. Historical artifacts could be cataloged and displayed. But a place that facilitated voluntary disappearance, without coercion or spectacle, did not fit into any acceptable category. To engage with it honestly would require acknowledging that there were forms of exit society preferred not to recognize. This realization sharpened his resolve to continue quietly on his own. He returned to the canyon again, not directly to the cabin, but to its surroundings. He studied the approach path, the points where the trail narrowed and widened, the places where the rock wall pressed so close that the body had no choice but to turn sideways. With each visit, he noticed small, cumulative changes. A stone repositioned to prevent slipping. A fragile edge reinforced with a fragment so carefully chosen that it seemed grown rather than placed. These adjustments were never dramatic. They did not announce maintenance. They merely preserved possibility. He began to document these changes privately, marking them in a notebook he did not file. Dates, locations, sketches. Over time, a pattern emerged. The maintenance was regular, but not constant. It occurred in intervals as though triggered by use rather than schedule. Someone tended the trail only when it had been walked. This confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The cabin was not abandoned. It was dormant between visitors. One evening, while reviewing his notes, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. The intervals between maintenance events aligned with the waves he had identified in the historical disappearances, periods of intense activity, followed by long stretches of nothing. The trail was quiet until it was needed again. The idea that there might be a living caretaker no longer seemed sufficient. This was not the work of a single individual aging quietly in the canyon. It was continuity without visibility, a role rather than a person, a function that endured even as its participants changed. The ranger returned to the cabin at dusk on a day when the canyon lay heavy with heat. He did not announce himself, nor did he attempt to hide. He simply walked the trail as he had before, attentive, deliberate. The path felt narrower than usual, though he could not say whether that was physical or psychological. The rock wall to his right seemed closer, its surface warm beneath his hand. The drop to his left felt more absolute. The river below a distant, indifferent presence. Inside the cabin, the air was still. The bones lay unchanged, but the emptiness at the center drew his gaze immediately. He felt more strongly than ever that it was not merely an absence. It was an active element, a space that held meaning precisely because it was kept clear. He noticed something new then, something he had not seen before. At the edge of the empty place, almost imperceptible against the floorboards, was a faint mark. Not a footprint, not a scuff, but a subtle disturbance in the dust that suggested someone had stood there briefly and then stepped away. The impression was too light to have been made by someone who lingered. It was the mark of hesitation. The ranger felt a chill run through him. Whoever had left that trace had not completed the process. They had come to the threshold and turned back. He understood suddenly that the cabin did not function as a trap. It was a test. Those who stayed were not compelled. They were confirmed. The empty place was not waiting to be filled indiscriminately. It was waiting for someone who could stand there without fear, without longing, without resistance. This realization reframed everything he had learned. The rules of the cabin were not simply about disappearance. They were about readiness. The people whose bones formed the map had not been drawn there by despair alone. They had arrived at a point in their lives where nothing else remained unresolved. Their withdrawal was not an escape, but a conclusion. The ranger left the cabin before night fell, but the sense of being evaluated did not leave with him. Over the following weeks, he became acutely aware of his own internal state. Old memories surfaced unbidden, choices made and paths not taken. Relationships that had faded without dramatic endings, leaving behind a residue of unfinished emotion. He had always considered his life orderly, purposeful. Now he saw how much of that order had been constructed around avoidance. The canyon seemed to respond to this shift. On his patrols, he noticed that the land felt different, less distant. The familiar sounds carried new weight. The wind along the cliffs no longer felt random, but directional. He began to recognize subtle patterns in the way shadows fell, in the timing of bird calls, in the moments when the canyon fell completely silent. These were not signs of something supernatural. They were signs of attention. Pressure from above increased, though it remained indirect. His patrol routes were adjusted, steering him away from the canyon sector more frequently. He was assigned additional administrative tasks, temporary responsibilities that kept him indoors. The message was clear enough. He was not to involve himself further. He complied on paper. In practice, he continued to observe. He learned to approach the canyon at irregular times, to vary his routes, to appear less predictable. Each visit confirmed the same truth. The trail remained viable. The cabin remained intact. The maintenance continued, invisible and precise. One afternoon, he discovered a small cache hidden among the rocks near a bend in the trail. It was not marked, but its placement suggested intentional concealment. Inside were a few simple items: dried plant matter, a length of cord, a small container of water. Nothing modern, nothing labeled. The supplies were minimal, but sufficient for someone beginning the process of staying. He replaced the cache exactly as he had found it and withdrew without comment. That night, he dreamed of the map. In the dream, the bones were not static. They shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, responding to changes in the canyon itself. The river's course adjusted, and the lines of bones followed. The central emptiness remained fixed, unaffected by movement around it. He stood above it, watching, aware that his own position was being measured against that stillness. When he woke, the dream did not fade as dreams usually did. It left behind a residue of understanding. The map was not merely a record of those who had come before. It was a living system, one that required balance. Each person who entered it altered its structure slightly, refining its accuracy. The empty place was not missing, it was essential. The ranger began to realize that his discovery of the cabin had not been accidental in the conventional sense. He had not simply stumbled upon it due to curiosity or chance. He fit a pattern. Like the ranger before him whose records had ended abruptly, he occupied a position of liminality. He lived on the boundary between order and isolation, between service and withdrawal. He had no immediate ties that would anchor him firmly elsewhere. This recognition frightened him, but it also clarified something he had been reluctant to admit. The idea of the cabin no longer repelled him. It unsettled him. Yes, but it also resonated. The discipline, the clarity, the absence of spectacle, the possibility of leaving without burden. He did not mistake this for desire. It was something more restrained, a recognition of alignment. One evening, as the sun set behind the canyon walls, he stood at a distance from the trailhead and watched the shadows lengthen. He did not move toward the cabin. He did not turn away. He simply stood and allowed the thought to exist without resolution. The empty place, he understood now, did not demand action. It waited, and waiting in its own way was a form of selection. The final stage did not announce itself with urgency. There was no sudden crisis, no event that forced the ranger toward a decision. Instead, the pressure came from subtraction. Over time, elements of his life that had once seemed essential began to lose their weight, not because they were taken from him, but because they no longer held him in place. The reassignment arrived quietly, folded into an email framed as a routine operational adjustment. His jurisdiction would shift away from the canyon permanently. Another ranger would assume responsibility for the sector. It was presented as a neutral administrative decision, justified by staffing needs and efficiency. There was no accusation, no acknowledgement of his interest in the area. The message was clear precisely because it was unspoken. His proximity to the cabin was no longer acceptable. He read the message several times, then closed his laptop and sat in the dim light of his office. The room felt smaller than it once had, its walls closer, its familiar objects oddly insubstantial. This was the moment he had anticipated, though he had not known when or how it would come. The system had done what systems always did when confronted with something they could not process. It had redirected. That night, he did not go home immediately. Instead, he drove until the paved road gave way to gravel, then farther still, until even the gravel thinned into dirt. He parked at the edge of the restricted zone and stepped out into the cooling air. The canyon lay beyond, invisible but present, a dark mass against the fading sky. He stood there for a long time, listening. The sounds of the world, wind through sparse trees, the distant call of an unseen bird, felt sharpened, as though he were hearing them for the last time. He was not afraid. What he felt was closer to gravity, a pull that did not rush but did not release. He understood now why the cabin had endured, why it had never become public knowledge, never drawn attention that could not be deflected. It survived not because it hid, but because it offered no leverage. There was no crime to prosecute, no spectacle to condemn, no doctrine to expose. It did not recruit, it did not persuade. It waited for those who arrived already aligned with its purpose. The ranger thought of the people whose bones formed the map, former monks who had broken from their orders without renouncing belief, ascetics who had stepped away from communities when their vows no longer required witnesses, individuals who had chosen to remove themselves not out of despair, but out of completion. They had come to the cabin because nothing else demanded their presence. He asked himself with brutal honesty what demanded his. There were no children waiting for him, no partner whose life would be shattered by his absence, no unfinished work that only he could complete. His service had been steady and unremarkable, his contributions absorbed seamlessly into a system designed to function without any single individual. Even his discovery of the cabin, momentous as it felt to him, had been quietly neutralized. The world would continue without adjusting its course. The realization was not painful, it was clarifying. He returned home and began to prepare, though he would not have described it that way if asked. He canceled subscriptions, he returned borrowed items, he organized his belongings with care, separating what could be donated from what would simply be discarded. There was no sense of secrecy in these actions. He was not hiding a plan. He was simplifying. He left letters unsent. Words felt unnecessary. Anything he might explain would introduce interpretation, and interpretation would invite questions. The people who had come before him had understood this. Disappearance, to be clean, required silence. On his final morning at the station, he completed his duties with particular attentiveness. He closed out files, updated logs, ensured that nothing remained unfinished. His colleagues noticed nothing unusual. He had always been reliable, methodical. Today was no different. When he left, no one watched him go. The trail was quieter than he had ever known it. The maintenance had been done recently. The path felt secure beneath his feet. The rock wall guided him without resistance, its surface familiar to his touch. He moved with ease, his body remembering the careful choreography required by the narrow ledge. The cabin emerged from the bend in the trail exactly as before. It did not look more significant now that he understood it. If anything, it appeared simpler, stripped of mystery by familiarity. The door stood closed, unlatched. Inside, the air held the same stillness, the same faint herbal trace. The bones lay undisturbed. The map was complete except for the one place it had always left open. The empty center waited, not as a demand, but as a condition. He set down the small pack he had brought. There was nothing in it that would matter for long. He walked the perimeter once more, his eyes tracing the lines of bone, the careful curves that mirrored the canyon's form. He recognized now how precise it was, how patiently it had been refined by those who had come before him. He understood, too, that this was not a ritual of death. There was no requirement that he remain, no force compelling him to step into the center. He could turn back even now. The cabin would not prevent it. Others had done so. Their hesitation marks remained faintly visible in the dust. He stood at the edge of the empty place and felt the absence as a presence, a stillness that accepted him without expectation. He did not feel the urge to kneel or pray. There was no ceremony to perform. The rules of the cabin did not require gestures. They required only honesty. He thought briefly of the ranger whose records had ended decades earlier, of the others whose names had faded from archives without alarm, of the way the canyon had held them without comment. He realized that their choice had not been an escape from life, but a refusal to impose themselves upon it any longer. When he stepped into the empty place, it was with deliberate calm. The dust shifted beneath his boots, leaving a clear imprint. He remained standing, feeling the alignment settle around him, the way the map seemed to resolve with his presence. There was no revelation, no surge of emotion, only a profound quiet, deeper than any he had known. He stayed there for a long time. Later, when the light shifted and the shadows changed, the empty place would no longer be empty. The map would adjust, incorporating him not as a name, but as a shape, a line, a contribution to the land's understanding of itself. The cabin would continue to wait, maintained by hands that required no recognition. And somewhere beyond the canyon, the world would continue, unburdened by his absence, unaware that anything had changed at all. If this story kept you thinking, don't forget to subscribe for more dark and mysterious stories like this. Check out the next video and other stories on the channel, and share this video with someone who loves unsettling discoveries. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from.